Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Friday module for MC 200. I just wanted to check in with you guys because I know that these past 2 weeks have been a lot of material, but you guys are really doing great in all of your discussion posts and assignments. I'm really proud of where the class is so far. I know that this is a lot of work and it makes it seem like even more work because it's all listed out on a module or a syllabus, where a lot of the in-class work you wouldn't have on a syllabus if you were in person. So I know sometimes it feels overwhelming, but I just want to encourage you guys that you're doing a great job and I'm so proud of you. So this video will be going over Chapter 4, Part 2 on common writing errors. So your textbook talks about a lot of common writing errors and provides some tips on how to solve that, but I want to go over these with you because they are really important in improving your writing. There are professional standards of writing in the media that you really have to meet in order to be considered part of the profession. These standards of writing separate professional writers from amateur writers, and a lot of times it's very easy to tell who belongs as a journalist and who doesn't based solely on writing. For almost any media profession job that you are going into, even if you're a videographer or an anchor or something like that, you're going to be asked to complete a writing test because they know the importance of writing. And so when you're doing writing tests and when you're improving your media writing style, these are some of the common errors that I would look for when I was trying to hire news producers in the television station. The first is the overuse of adjectives and adverbs. Adjectives lack specificity, meaning that they're not really specific. They don't tell you much information. They're really just meant to color or add opinion to something. A lot of times media bias sneaks in with these adjectives and adverbs, and it also wastes space. So we really want to avoid them as much as possible. Cliches are another thing that I think journalists use as a crutch when they're under a tight writing period. Cliches are phrases that are used over and over, and often they lose their original impact because they've been used so often. For example, in the political world, you may have heard the phrase, toss your hat into the ring. But what does that really mean? It has no actual meaning, and it's not original. It's really tried, it's been overused. So especially in political and crime news, you want to be aware of any cliche phrases you may be using. You also want to avoid slang. And this is not to keep your particular voice from coming through. It's more because as media professionals, we're trying to reach a large population of people. And that includes various ages, ethnicities, religious beliefs, political beliefs, etc. And slang is a little too informal and can be seen as unprofessional when included in media writing. Plus, slang outdates pretty quickly. And so it is not very helpful for you to have a portfolio that includes slang words, because if someone is looking at a piece that says on fleek, 2 years from now, that's going to seem very old and outdated, and it will really hurt you professionally. In addition, slang can also creep in some bias, so make sure that you're avoiding slang. Don't use jargon either. Jargon is the term to refer to words that only people in a profession or trade understand. It tends to be very confusing, and jargon happens most when we're writing from press releases and trying to transform that into news. So if you get a press release from, let's say, a police department, and they're talking about an assailant, you have to make that jargon more conversational to the everyday person. Remember, we're writing at a third, maybe fifth grade level, and most third graders are not going to know what an assailant is. So make sure that you're translating jargon to be updated. In addition, jargon takes up a lot of space. If you're pulling a quote from a press release about an intersection, this top sentence is really wordy, it's hard to get through, and In the end, it really just says police say the intersection is dangerous. So I was able to say in 6 words what it takes 4 lines to say in the press release. So this is why we have to avoid jargon. We also want to avoid euphemisms. Euphemisms are vague expressions used in place of harsher or more offensive terms. A lot of times we use euphemisms to kind of sidestep an uncomfortable conversation, such as saying, instead of saying someone has died, we say they pass away. Or in the case of employment, you would say that you are a victim of corporate downsizing instead of saying that you were laid off or fired. And so we as journalists want to be more straightforward with our audience and therefore should really avoid euphemisms. We also want to avoid profanity, and you would think that this is pretty common sense, and yet unfortunately we see profanity used a lot in media, and particularly in younger writers who may not understand why it's not appropriate. And the reason it's not appropriate is, again, that we're communicating to a wide general public, which can include everyone from children to very conservative, moderate adults who don't like to hear profanity. In addition, there are some regulations for broadcast mediums on the types of words that can be used across airwaves, and so we have to be very careful about that. But, profanity may depend upon your organizational preference. If you're quoting someone who has said a curse word, there's some organizations that would prefer for you to use the actual curse word, while others may replace the letters of profanity in a quote with like an asterisk or dash. But try to not be this US news anchor who had a really rough first day on the job. Yeah, so he claims that he didn't know that they were on air. Yeah, that's not an excuse in broadcasting. And he was fired after the first 30 seconds of him appearing on air. So make sure you're avoiding profanity. Also, try to avoid platitudes, which is stating the obvious, or just saying something that's boring and trite that everyone knows. This is very common in politics. I think about all the school shooting research that I do, and how often I hear politicians say that their thoughts and prayers are with the victims, which is not a bad thing in and of itself. Of course, we want our politicians to be thinking and praying about people who have been hurt by an incident. But when you are using it as a platitude, something that's just easy to say, that's when it becomes trite and boring and people lose interest. In fact, a lot of the Parkland survivors, particularly in the March for Our Lives movement, really got angry with politicians who would say this and then not act. And so we want to avoid using very common, boring ideas because there's really just no space for it in media. You also need to avoid first person. In journalism, the story should never be about you. If the story has become about you, it's usually because something really bad has happened, like you are under controversy, you have done something wrong as a professional and are being scrutinized for your position as a journalist. We should not use first person within our everyday writing, which includes I, me, we, our, and us, because it suggests bias. It suggests that your opinion and your experience matters more than the general public's, and we want to avoid that. There is one exception, of course, in broadcasting. A lot of times you tag out, like, I'm Danielle Devers reporting for Velovision. That's okay because you're just identifying yourself and your position as a journalist. The same for a byline. You can certainly use your name in a byline, but within our writing and our copy itself, you're going to want to avoid first person. You also need to avoid negative constructions. If you have 2 or more negative words in a sentence, it becomes wordy and difficult to understand. We don't want a reader or a listener to have to stop and think about what the meaning of the sentence is. So avoid negative constructions as much as possible and try to write in the positive. We also need to avoid echoes, which are repetition or redundancy of unnecessary words. A lot of times we may use repetition to kind of emphasize something. I put evidence there, that's wrong. It should be emphasize. But we can use repetition to emphasize a point, but if you're not doing that purposefully, you should eliminate it. Gush is exaggerated enthusiasm. This tends to happen a lot in feature stories where we're coming back from, you know, this organization that presented a check to a nonprofit. And we're like, wow, isn't that just great? The company is awesome. Well, you have just biased your information because you have given your opinion, praised and advocated that company. And then when they're in the news tomorrow for doing something bad, you know, you're kind of on the hook as really supporting that organization. So we want to avoid gush and increase of modifiers or adjectives as much as possible. One way that you can avoid this is by using multiple sources. So even within some of those fluffier feature stories, if you have multiple people who are praising or advocating the organization from various viewpoints, it makes it a lot easier for them to get the praise that they need for doing the right thing without you advocating for them. In the same instance, if you have an organization that is donating and trying to get some good PR in order to come back from a crisis, you can still bring up the fact that, you know, they had this controversy, and that helps you kind of balance out the gush with the whole picture of what's really going on. So a lot of times we simply need to delete any gush that we have within our copy. We also want to avoid vague time references. Because media lives on, and a lot of times it's hard to know the day that something is written without explicitly going and looking at the date of the paper or byline or post. We want to avoid time references like yesterday, tomorrow. Try to avoid today and tomorrow in mediums that will last more than one day. So, you know, newspapers, digital, social media in particular. Instead, we want to use specific dates, because if I'm looking up something on the web and I'm trying to find out when something is, if you say today, I have to go back and see what day it was posted to know what date it actually happened. You can use today, tomorrow, and yesterday within quotes, but don't use it within your copy. Avoid excessive punctuation as well. We should not be using exclamation points within our own copy unless there is a real reason to do it. So try to avoid using exclamations as much as possible. We also don't want to use dashes or parentheses, and this is because if they become complicated, again, the reader has to stop and think about what you're meaning. So if you find it necessary to put a dash or parentheses to explain something, it's better to offset it with commas as a non-essential clause, or just paraphrase it so that you don't have to go into further explanations. So the back of our textbook has review exercises for chapter 4. If there's an area of these common writing areas that you think you may struggle with, you may want to glance at it and use those as practice. This is not an assignment that I would be grading or anything, but if you have questions about what the answers are, I'm happy to look at it. Again, this is completely optional. I know you have a lot on your plates, but I wanted to point this out as a good resource in case you're struggling with a particular area. So now that you've watched the video for today, which goes over all of chapter 4, we're done with chapter 4 now, you can go into the discussion post about accuracy mattering, whether it matters in the digital age. Then do your homework, which will be in the workbook for chapter 4. You'll do exercise 5, sections 1 through 5. In addition, you need to read the punctuation section of the AP style book and watch the video on punctuation. You will have AP homework. We have Labor Day holiday on Monday, so all of your homework, including the workbook and your AP homework, are due by Wednesday. And then we'll be going over chapter 5 on Wednesday as well, so make sure you do that reading. Hope you guys have a great long weekend and be safe, everyone.